Somewhere in southern Chile, a team was carefully clearing away wet, black peat and a brush snagged on something solid. Not a root. Cut wood. Wooden stakes, still standing upright after 14,000 years, outlining the shape of ancient shelters, old fire pits, and even a child's footprint pressed into hardened clay. The problem was never really the age. The problem was the location, sitting at the bottom of 2 entire continents, thousands of miles from where the first Americans were supposed to have entered, and older than the people who were supposed to be first. For decades, the safe, comfortable answer was that sites like this one had to be wrong. This was only the very first crack. A creek bank that shouldn't have survived. The place is called Monte Verde, a creek bank in a cold, boggy stretch of southern Chile, roughly 30 miles from the Pacific coast. Excavations began there in 1976, led by an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay. And what came out of that ground wasn't just a scatter of stone chips. It was an entire settlement. Wooden foundations from a long structure divided into separate rooms, clay-lined fire pits, animal bone, plant remains including chewed seaweed hauled all the way up from the coast, and a footprint left by a child in soft ground that later hardened and simply waited. None of that material normally survives this long. It survived only because a peat bog eventually rolled over the old campsite and sealed it inside oxygen-starved mud, the kind of airless, sealed grave that stops wood from rotting and keeps even a half-eaten meal recognizable after thousands of years. Then came the number. The main occupation layer dated to roughly 14,500 years ago. That doesn't sound especially shocking until you understand exactly which wall it slammed into. The wall called Clovis first. For most of the 20th century, the answer to who were the first Americans was essentially fixed in stone. They were the Clovis people, named after a distinctive style of fluted stone spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico. The story was clean. Big game hunters crossed over from Siberia during the Ice Age, waited for a gap to open between 2 massive ice sheets, walked south through that ice-free corridor around 13,000 years ago, and then spread out across an otherwise empty hemisphere. Firmly dated Clovis material clustered around 13,000 years old. That was the baseline. That was treated as the floor of American history. To be fair, this wasn't a foolish idea. It was built on the real evidence available at the time, and it held up for generations. But a clean, simple story has a way of becoming something more than just a theory over time. It becomes the standard textbook chapter. It becomes an entire career path. It becomes the exact thing every graduate student learns to defend without question. And once a story carries that much weight, challenging it starts to feel less like ordinary science and more like a personal attack. Now hold Monte Verde up against that wall, 14,500 years old, sitting at the far southern tip of South America. For people to be there by that point, they had to have already entered the continent, traveled the entire length of 2 landmasses, and settled in, all supposedly before the door in the north was even open yet. One single southern site quietly made the entire northern story look far too small. Doubt that wasn't gentle. So the field did exactly what fields tend to do with evidence that arrives too early. It doubted, and that doubt wasn't gentle at all. Pre-Clovis claims already had a long history of being dismissed outright, labeled as contamination, disturbed soil layers, sloppy excavation work, or simple wishful thinking. And to be fair, there were real reasons behind that caution. Older sites really had collapsed under close scrutiny before, but those legitimate reasons eventually hardened into an unbreakable wall, and that wall came with a side effect. It made the researcher, not the model itself, into the actual risk. Dillahay wasn't just arguing for a single date on a chart. He was effectively arguing against the entire shape of an established discipline. And for years, the safest bet for everyone else in the field was simply to assume he was wrong. Then something genuinely rare happened. In 1997, a group of prominent skeptics flew all the way to Chile specifically to inspect Monte Verde in person. They arrived intending to tear it apart. Instead, they signed off on it. The main occupation layer was real, and it was genuinely pre-Clovis. Textbooks eventually got rewritten. The wall now had a hole punched clean through it, but the field never actually apologized. It simply adjusted. It absorbed the new date and moved on, treating the whole ordeal as though it had been a polite academic disagreement rather than what it actually was. Decades of stubborn refusal. And here's what almost nobody said out loud at the time. If a single site could break through that wall, the wall was never nearly as solid as everyone had insisted it was, which naturally raised a colder follow-up question. Was Monte Verde really alone? The layers beneath the accepted layer. It wasn't, because Monte Verde itself wasn't even finished revealing its secrets. Below and around the now accepted layer sat other traces, and deeper and far more genuinely contested. A lower component, sometimes referred to as Monte Verde Fur, produced stones and possible fire pit remains with radiocarbon dates stretching past 30,000 years. Later work at the site, and at a nearby location called Chinchihuapi, turned up even more. In 2015, Dillahay's team published evidence of scattered low-density human activity, burned material, stone fragments, and bone spread across a window reaching from around 14,500 years back toward possibly 19,000 years ago. Let's be honest about this part. The main 14 to 500 year layer is genuinely solid ground. The deeper material underneath it is legitimately disputed, thin, ambiguous, exactly the kind of evidence critics are right to keep questioning. But notice the larger pattern forming here. One strange anomaly might just be a mistake. The same single site producing progressively older and older dates across multiple separate excavations, decade after decade, stops looking like a simple mistake. It starts looking like mounting pressure. Then the map jumped north, and then the whole map lurched hard to the north. In New Mexico, out on the gypsum flats of white sands, researchers found something that didn't need a laboratory to feel real. Footprints. Human footprints pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore, then buried and preserved, not just one or two isolated trackways. And when they were dated, the number came back even worse than Monte Verde, somewhere between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Think about what that actually means. 23,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, the coldest, iciest peak of the entire last ice age. The ice-free corridor wasn't open at that point. It was solid ice. The clean migration route the entire model depended on physically could not have carried anyone south during that window. And yet here were people, already deep inside the continent, walking across a wetland alongside giant ground sloths and mammoths. The footprints are the part your gut simply can't argue away. A date stamped on an old bone feels abstract. This is a person. In one trackway, someone appears to have been carrying a small child, setting them down, then picking them back up again. The toddler's tiny prints flickering in and out of view beside the adults. A single rescued moment from a real, ordinary day, 23,000 years ago. The footprint outlasted the person who made it. An objection. That backfired. Naturally, the field pushed back, and the objection raised was genuinely clever. The original dates came from seeds of ditch grass, an aquatic plant. Aquatic plants can absorb old carbon that's already dissolved in the surrounding water, which can make a radiocarbon date read far older than the actual object really is. It was a reasonable objection to raise. It was also exactly the kind of objection that conveniently protects an old, established model. If the seeds turned out to be unreliable, the whole uncomfortable finding could simply disappear. So a team led by geologist Vance Holliday went back to the site and, instead of relying on the seeds again, dated everything else available. Terrestrial pollen pulled from the very same layers. Ancient lakebed mud, quartz grains, tested using an entirely different method called optically stimulated luminescence, which has nothing whatsoever to do with carbon. They sent samples out to independent laboratories. Same answer came back. Same time window. Roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years. They tested it a second, completely different way, and it came back the same. Then they tested it a third way, and it came back the same again. That's the exact moment an objection stops functioning as a rescue and starts becoming a genuine problem. The wall no longer had a comfortable edge to hide behind. If the corridor was sealed, how did they get there? And once you accept that people were standing at White Sands during the absolute peak of the Ice Age, the old migration route essentially detonates. If they were already deep inside the continent while the corridor sat completely sealed shut, they clearly didn't travel through that corridor at all. So how did they actually get there? The field reached for a lifeline it had spent years openly mocking. The idea that the first Americans never marched through the frozen interior at all, but instead hugged the Pacific shoreline, moving steadily south along a rich, food-abundant edge of kelp forests, seals, fish, and shellfish, a so-called kelp highway that let small groups and boats leapfrog down the coastline while the interior of the continent remained locked in ice. For a long time, saying that theory out loud in academic circles was close to career suicide. There was no physical site anyone could actually point to as proof. But once the interior dates kept pushing further and further back, the coastal route stopped being a fringe idea and quietly became the only theory that actually still fit the evidence. It didn't win the argument outright. It simply survived long enough that the field eventually grew uncomfortable enough to shift its position. The coastline that sank. But here's the cruel twist buried inside the coastal migration story. You can barely excavate any of it because the actual Ice Age coastline these people would have walked along is gone. When the glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically, and that ancient shoreline now sits under 100 meters or more of open ocean. Every camp, every fire pit, every landing spot along that entire route is completely drowned. So when critics spent decades insisting there was no evidence for an early coastal migration, they were technically half right and half trapped by their own framing. Maybe the first Americans genuinely didn't leave behind much evidence on land. Or maybe we've simply been standing on the wrong beach this entire time, digging through the interior while the real story quietly sank beneath the waves. A claim that makes everything else look cautious. And this is exactly where the argument stops being careful and starts getting genuinely dangerous, because there's one site out there that makes everything you've just read look almost conservative by comparison. During a highway expansion project in San Diego back in 1992, paleontologists recovered the broken bones of a mastodon. Nothing especially unusual about that on its own. What was unusual was exactly how those bones were broken. Spiral fractures, the kind you typically get when bone is smashed while it's still fresh, clustered around large stones that resembled hammers and anvils, some showing clear impact wear. In 2017, in the journal Nature, a research team led by Tom Demarais and Steve Holland stated the claim outright. This was a location where humans had processed a mastodon carcass, and the bone material. So let me be completely clear here, because honesty matters most exactly at this point. Most archaeologists do not accept the Kurudi mastodon site as legitimate evidence. The criticisms leveled against it are genuinely serious. Heavy construction machinery was actively working directly above the site and could easily have cracked those bones on its own. Nature breaks both stones and bones all the time without any human involvement. The uranium date applies only to the bone itself, not to any actually proven human presence at the location. This is not solid proof that anyone was in California 130,000 years ago. And it absolutely should not be sold to you as such. But watch what actually happened around the claim, separate entirely from whether it's true or not. The moment this claim appeared publicly, the field mobilized almost instantly to shut it down, fast and hard. And you don't have to personally believe Kurudi to notice something a little uncomfortable in that particular reaction. Once the old wall had already fallen at Monte Verde, and once footprints had already appeared dating back to the Ice Age peak, that reflexive rush to instantly crush an extreme new claim started looking a lot less like careful scientific caution, and a lot more like a discipline that had simply learned exactly how much it hates being caught off guard. The story moves into the blood. Then the story shifted somewhere no shovel could ever reach, straight into human genetics. When researchers sequenced ancient and living Native American genomes, most of the overall picture matched the expected story reasonably well. A single founding population originating out of Siberia. But buried inside that genetic data was something that simply refused to sit still. A faint, unusual signal showed up in certain Amazonian groups, peoples like the Surui and Caritiana, that matched more closely with indigenous Australians and Melanesians, populations from the literal opposite side of the planet. Researchers nicknamed the mysterious source behind this signal Population Y. To be clear, nobody credible is claiming some lost civilization sailed directly from Australia to South America. But the genetic signal itself is real, published, peer-reviewed, and still actively argued over today. And what it quietly does to the clean, simple version of the story is devastating. The peopling of the Americas was clearly never one tidy wave of one tidy population walking through one tidy gap in the ice. The bones said earlier than expected. The footprint said something that felt nearly impossible. And the DNA said there was more than one single story unfolding at once. A pattern, not a coincidence. Step back for a moment and look at the full shape of everything laid out here. Monte Verde. The deeper, more contested Chilean layers underneath it. White sands sitting right at the peak of the Ice Age. A drowned coastal migration route we can barely access. A genetic ghost population hiding inside modern DNA. Each individual piece, taken entirely on its own, could reasonably be doubted. But taken together, they stop looking like careful caution and start looking like a clear pattern. An entire field reaching for whatever explanation might let the old, familiar maps survive just one more year. And to be fair, this was never any kind of organized conspiracy. There was no secret meeting held behind closed doors, no buried file waiting to be discovered, no single villain to point to. It was something far more ordinary and honestly far more dangerous than any conspiracy could be. It was inertia. It was professional reputation. It was the simple, unglamorous fact that the same people who had built their entire careers on the clean version of the story were often the very same people reviewing the papers that threatened to unravel it. Nobody ever needed to hide anything deliberately. Simple Doubt did all the necessary work for free. It wasn't really a lie either. It was a discipline quietly defending the shape of what it already believed it knew, being fair about what we actually know. So let's be genuinely fair about where things actually stand, because the drama here is real, but the honesty has to be just as real. Here's what's now firmly established. People were living in the Americas well before the Clovis culture existed. Clovis first, as a standalone theory, is dead. The coastal migration route is very likely correct, but remains extremely hard to definitively prove while the physical evidence sits underwater. The strange genetic signal is real, but it remains fundamentally unexplained. It was simply defended far too aggressively, for far too long. well past the point where the evidence actually justified that level of certainty. And when it finally did give way, it never gave way with any kind of formal apology. It gave way gradually, through softer textbook language and quietly redrawn maps. The retreat happened entirely in the footnotes. And then the ground moved again. And then, right as this whole story seemed to be finally settling into place, the ground shifted again, right back at the very site where it had all started. Because in 2026, an entirely new independent research team returned to Monte Verde for the first serious outside look at the site in nearly 50 years. And remarkably, they came back arguing something that sounds almost impossible, that Monte Verde might not actually be 14,500 years old at all, that it could instead be much younger, dating only to somewhere around 4,000 to 8,000 years old. Their reasoning centers on a few key points. Much of the wood originally dated at the site, they argue, may actually be much older Ice Age material that was simply redeposited by water long after the original Ice Age had ended. They also point to a layer of volcanic ash, dated to roughly 11,000 years old, sitting below the supposed occupation layer, when logically it should sit above it if the site were genuinely as ancient as originally claimed. Not everyone in the field accepts this dramatic reversal either. The debate remains completely live and unresolved as you're watching this. But notice what this new controversy proves, regardless of who ultimately turns out to be correct. The exact same doubt machine that spent decades stubbornly refusing to let Monte Verde be considered old is now apparently running in reverse, refusing to let it stay old. The underlying certainty never actually disappeared. It simply changed direction, and the very site that once single-handedly broke the entire accepted timeline is now the one sitting back under the knife. What won't move, no matter how. This fight ends. Here's what stays true regardless of how this particular argument eventually resolves. White Sands still stands firm. The other established pre-Clovis sites still stand firm. Clovis first is still dead as a standalone theory. The overall human story in the Americas is still meaningfully older and far messier than the clean, tidy version we were taught for generations. But if we still can't even fully agree on the age of the single most famous site in this entire argument, think carefully about how much of the real, complete story we still haven't even touched yet. Sealed under peat inside a Chilean bog, pressed into gypsum out on a New Mexico flat, and most of it quite possibly drowned completely along an entire coastline that no archaeologist currently has any real way to dig into. A shoreline sitting underwater and permanently out of reach, while an endless tide rolls in over footprints that we may simply never find. The old story was always too small to contain the truth. The retreat has happened quietly, and the ground, quite literally, is still arguing.